All right. Welcome everybody to this final session of our 2024 series dedicated to the concept of law in modern philosophy. Once again, thanks everybody for participating. Thanks to speakers. We have three of them right here for sharing their research with us. And thanks to Edith Dolph-Einstein, my co-chair on the organizing committee of VAMP, Vanderbilt Modern Philosophy. To conclude our series today, we have Andrew Burnside, our own Andrew Burnside from Vanderbilt, who is going to talk about the PSR as a law of nature in Émilie du Châtelet philosophy. Take it away.
Okay, let me get this PowerPoint pulled up and maximize that so everyone can see it. Okay, should be working. So first I wanted to say it's an honor to present a woman philosopher to you, Emilie du Châtelet, who unfortunately has not had, up until very recent time, very much shrift given to her oeuvre overall, because she comes at a really interesting period where a lot of people want to cast her between Newton and Leibniz, right? Or they want to talk about her affair with Voltaire, or they want to talk about how she is a stepstone to Kant, who actually cites her, right? But I'm going to do something I hope a bit different today. I'm going to couch her view in between Spinoza and Leibniz, but in a way in which her really originality comes first. So I'll present to you Emilie du Châtelet, the principle of sufficient reason as a law of nature. So I'll start with a bit of a roadmap, just talking about where we're going to go here. Then I'll jump right in. So I'm actually going to start with Emilie du Châtelet and introducing just a bit about her and her life and with whom she studied. And then I'll lead into an unfortunate but very important person to still talk about, but the connection to Kant. After that, I'll talk a bit about the history of the PSR in early modern philosophy. So we'll go through Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz very briskly. I'll focus more on Leibniz there. And then for the second half of the talk, it'll just be Emilie du Châtelet on the PSR. So we'll talk mostly about her view of contingency and then what she thinks of the understanding or basically intellection before concluding. And there we'll talk more about laws generally, especially her analysis of Newton's laws of nature. Okay, so I'll start by introducing du Châtelet and then talk a bit about Kant because he actually is important for this, even though I mentioned that her views themselves don't get as much shrift. So her full name was Gabrielle Emilie Le Tonnelier de Bouteille, Marquise du Châtelet, after marrying the Marquis du Châtelet. So she did not live very long. She lived about 42. She lived 42 years. And most people remember her for this, but as I mentioned, we're not talking too much about this, so maybe this is the last time I'll mention his name. But she actually meets Voltaire in 1729. But then they begin really a companionship in multiple senses in 1733. And that, of course, that drama is the focus of a lot of people's attention. But I think it's notable to mention that besides studying philosophy, she also studies mathematics with Maupertuis, who's really known in physics for the principle of least action, right? That if one thing is moving to another location, that it takes basically the path of least resistance. It's also, I think, notable that she translated Newton's Principia into French, and that's still actually the dominant translation in French readership of Newton's Principia. It wasn't published until after she died, though, which was at the young age of 42 of a pulmonary embolism, as she gave birth to her fourth child. And her magnum opus, which is basically the main work we'll talk about today for the second half of the talk, was the Institution de Physique, which was published in 1740. And that book was actually dedicated and written for her son, basically, as a kind of an instruction manual in physics. But of course, at that time period, physics, philosophy, those things are linked. And we're going to see that come to I think, real prominent fruition with Du Châtelet. Okay. So before I talk about Du Châtelet's philosophy, though, I mentioned Kant, and I think it's really important to actually bring this to the fore, because the first person to actually talk about the PSR specifically as a law of nature was actually Kant, who comes after Du Châtelet, right? But he was in conversation with her through reading her work. So from the Critique of Pure Reason, this is in both editions. Here's a quote that I'll read from Kant. He writes, "The law of nature that everything that happens has a cause, that since the causality of this cause, that is, the action, proceeds in time but in respect of an effect that has arisen, cannot have been always but must have happened, and so must also have had its cause among appearances, through which it is determined, and consequently that all occurrences are empirically determined in a natural order. This law, through which one alone appearances can first constitute one nature and furnish objects of one experience, is a law of the understanding." A very unwieldy quote, but it is the first place, to my knowledge, in which the PSR is attributed specifically as a law of nature. And so Kant's basically saying here, of course, for him, it's to do with the realm of appearances, but the PSR has the status of natural law, right? So that's one place he puts it, but he puts it again after publishing the Critique of Pure Reason in 1790. And this is a long title, but it's a somewhat of a lesser known work in Kant's theoretical philosophy after the critical turn. And this is titled "On a Discovery Whereby Any New Critique of Pure Reason is to be made superfluous by an older one." And here he really engages with people who are interested in Wolff's philosophy. And I won't talk much about Wolff today, but he is important for this kind of transition to Kant. But here he actually, Kant, casts the principle of sufficient reason in Leibniz philosophy as a question of whether it's construed objectively or subjectively, whether we can attribute it to nature itself or just to the realm of appearances or understanding, right? So really this ends up being a question of realism versus idealism. But here's what Kant has to say, and he puts it kind of rhetorically. He questions, is it really credible that Leibniz wished to have his principle of sufficient reason construed objectively? And then in parentheses, he has, as a natural law in German, Naturgesetz, when he attributed great importance to it as an addition to previous philosophy. And then later, just a few lines down, Kant says, this is Kant's reading of Leibniz. Leibniz wanted to say only that beyond the principle of contradiction, as the principle of analytic judgments, still another principle, namely that of synthetic judgments, must be added, right? So Kant's view of Leibniz is that he's basically a philosophical idealist, right? That in accounting for analytic propositions, the principle of non-contradiction suffices, but for synthetic judgments where there's some kind of synthesis between the subject and some other predicate, that you need the principle of sufficient reason. So here I've got a slide kind of summarizing what we've got here. Of course, Kant has, which I can't talk about it now, but the distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments. And he is basically proposing it analogously, maybe more directly, to Leibniz on the nature of necessary versus contingent propositions. Because, and I can't, again, go into too much detail, but Leibniz is going to talk about necessary propositions being reducible to the principle of non-contradiction, whereas contingent propositions being more complex, not reducing down to the identity of subject and predicate, must be analyzed through the principle of sufficient reason. So I'm going to talk a lot more about that in just a moment once I get through the history. So Kant's really got this idea that Leibniz was not trying to propose the PSR as an objective principle of nature, right? Again, this is that question of idealism versus realism. So what I hope to kind of demonstrate once I get to Émilie du Châtelet is that her view is, I won't spoil it, but it's kind of an interesting road between the two. So besides, this is a lot at once, but besides Émilie du Châtelet, in the early modern period, of course, we've got more people talking about laws of nature. So in Descartes' Le Monde, he talks about three specific laws of nature. And I'm not going to really talk too much about these, but I wanted to flag them, that the relationship between the PSR and laws of nature, it's fecund in the early modern rationalists, but it doesn't come to fruition until Du Châtelet. So Descartes has these three laws of nature, which I'll just briefly skim through them. Right, first, unless an encounter with other bodies causes a change, each part of matter continues in the same state, size, shape, and position, if at rest, or motion, if in motion. Second law, when one body collides with another, it cannot give it any motion unless it loses as much as the other body gains. If it takes motion from the other body, it must gain as much motion as it takes away. And then final law, third law, if a body is in motion, even if it usually moves in a curved line, each of its parts will tend to move in a straight line, departing from that path only as constrained by other bodies. So interestingly, I think the third is actually kind of related to Maupertuis a bit, although I can't go into detail. So Descartes comes up with these laws of nature, but he also talks about the principle of sufficient reason, but he doesn't list it as a law of nature. So there's really a question here, given what we've seen about even just so far with the laws of nature in Descartes, and we'll see them just a bit later in Newton. But it's a question really of what the PSR is doing, right? Is the PSR grounding the laws of nature, or does it exist as a law of nature itself? Right. And so there's actually views about this in contemporary philosophy of science, which I'm not going to talk a whole lot about, except for this first guy up here on the non-Humean view, David Armstrong. I will mention his view briefly. So people have seen the kind of view that the PSR grounds the laws of nature as more of a non-Humean view. And the idea that it exists as a kind of regularity itself is a more Humean view. So David Armstrong is famous for this kind of thesis that the laws of nature are basically relations between universals, right? But there's a general skepticism in the early modern period about what relations can actually be, right? And so that even leads into humanist philosophy. So by and large, this question has to do with whether the PSR is going to be the thing that undergirds other laws of nature, or if somehow it is basically one itself. And so there's a few problems as to both of these views for pretty much anyone concerned with the question of what the PSR does in relation to laws of nature. And they are as follows. So for the question of affirmatively answering if the PSR just grounds the laws of nature, you're basically saying that laws do something to explain uniformities, that there are uniformities in nature, and the PSR can help to track why they're the case. Right? And then the other view, which is that the PSR exists as a law of nature itself, would be something more to say that these laws themselves are the uniformities, and the PSR is included within this set of uniformities. And as far as problems go, it basically looks like this. If you answer affirmatively to the PSR grounding the laws of nature, it looks like there's multiple layers, right? And it looks like that's not a feasible argument if there's to be one kind of uniform principle or conception of nature, right? If we're to say that there are laws at all, right, it doesn't seem to make sense, prima facie at least, how you can have laws upon these laws, right? And then there's a question of which laws would supervene on the other laws, right? So it makes things more messy, right? It's not a clean break or picture of what nature is. And then the other view, and this is really Armstrong's point against the Humeans. So you might say, okay, well, to avoid the idea that there could be a kingdom within a kingdom for grounding laws of nature through the PSR, what if the PSR were to be a law of nature itself, right? Or what if um, any other law of nature were to just be, right, and were to be considered as a part of nature? The risk is that you commit you commit the fallacy of begging the question, but it could be a vicious circle, right? And here's how the argument goes. It basically runs like this. If you say that the PSR explains nature as it is, the question of how nature is what it is still given by the explanation of the PSR, right? So the explanandum and the explanans are hard to distinguish once you've got this view that the PSR exists just as a law of nature, right? It seems like the PSR itself could become like a brute fact, right? which is actually a self-contradiction. So whether the PSR grounds the laws of nature or exists as itself a law of nature seems like stuck between kind of a brutal dilemma. But I want to say in what follows that Emilie du Châtelet answers affirmatively to both questions, right? So in a sense, it's not that this is a false dilemma for her, but it's rather that this is not an exclusive disjunction, right? That it's the case that the PSR can both ground the laws of nature and exist as a law of nature itself. And so here's my thesis put more precisely. Emilie du Châtelet's view of the PSR establishes it as both, first, grounds for positing other laws of nature, as well as being a law of nature itself. So her understanding of the PSR is basically a universal efficient causation. And it's also the comprehensibility of this fact. And so we'll get into the nitty-gritty in just a bit. And in this sense, she differs from her PSR predecessors, who I'll talk about in just a moment, in several key respects because of her focus on the comprehensibility of contingent truths. Because this is something that Leibniz actually does not do. He says, basically, it's up to God to understand the full broad strokes of a contingent proposition. Okay, so that'll suffice for an introduction. Now we'll move on to talk about Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, our favorite rationalists, to talk about the history of the PSR. And so I've already spoken a bit about Descartes on the laws of nature, but interestingly, Descartes does formulate the PSR, or something like what we'll all just call the PSR, in the responses to the objections to meditation too. So in the second meditation, Descartes gets asked basically to clarify very slowly in a more geometric fashion his his premises and conclusions. And so he obliges. He says, if you were to read my work carefully, this would be apparent basically. But here's what he comes up with. He comes up with, right, in a Euclidean fashion, right, axioms, definitions, and then certain things which follow from those. But of these, the first of the axioms or common notions, Descartes writes, is this idea that nothing exists of which we can't ask what the cause of its existence is, right? So this is a kind of universal, right? If there's something, then we can ask from whence it came, right? If I'm wearing this shirt as opposed to another shirt, there's some reason for why I chose to do so, right? I think, and this would hold for pretty much everything, right? Nulla res, right? There's no thing which exists of which I can't ask why it exists or what's the cause of its existence. And Spinoza picks up on this on the first, in the first book of the Principles of Cartesian Philosophy, Axiom 11, he's basically going to reproduce this pound for pound, right? So Descartes, even though he doesn't talk about the PSR in his exposition in Le Monde of the laws of nature, we get in Descartes a robust commitment to the PSR. So moving then to Spinoza, interestingly, Spinoza never outright states the PSR as an axiom. So some people reading that wonder, what's this focus, especially in contemporary scholarship on Spinoza, about the PSR? Where does he get it from? I think from a more historical perspective, of course, you can say Descartes, but you've got this view in De La Rocca that you do full justice to rationalism by following this PSR to its radical limit. And then we've got, I think, helpfully, Martin Lind's view, which is that you can actually derive the PSR from the axiom, kind of the setup of the axioms of the first book of the Ethics. All right, so if I were to take just one brief example, just take the first axiom, right? All things that are either in themselves or in something else. Of course, the Latin there is vel for the or, right? Of course, implying not both, which means that we can quantify universally over all things. Right, this kind of view that of all things, something follows or it doesn't about them is a kind of implicit commitment to the PSR. Right, that's the kind of view that I think rightfully Martin Lind advances. But there's actually one place where Spinoza does state it outright in the first book of the Ethics. That's the second proof to proposition 11 of part 1. Spinoza has this commitment to universal intelligibility baked in to this proof, where he says, to lead it off, and I'll state it and I'll move on. For everything, a cause or reason, causa sive ratio, which is a very common formula in early modern philosophy, must be assigned either for its existence or for its non-existence. So here we've got a kind of contrastivist picture, where it's not just, and I think this is very important to highlight, especially moving to Leibniz, it's not just the case that for each thing there's a cause given for its existence. It's stronger. It's actually, there must also be a reason why the things that don't exist don't exist. And for a lot of people, especially Jonathan Bennett, who I won't say too much about, I think that leads Spinoza down a necessitarian path, which is untenable, right? But here we see that there's a kind of contrastivism given, right? It's not just that each thing which exists has a cause assigned, but it's also that there are, for the things that don't exist, things which concurrently block its existence. So now moving to Leibniz, who is often attributed to be the basically the father of the PSR, insofar as he names it such, because in Spinoza he just states it, right? In Descartes, it's just given as an axiom. Leibniz reduces all the axioms of philosophy in the monadology to the principle of non-contradiction and the principle of sufficient reason. Right? He thinks they're reducible, or you could boil it down to these. And of course, this is a very classic moment in Leibniz, but he says for the, let's just call it the P&C, we judge that which involves a contradiction to be false, and that which is opposed or contradictory to the false to be true. And then moving to the focus, the PSR, we consider that we can find no true or existent fact, no true assertion, without there being a sufficient reason why it is thus and not otherwise, right? So he's also got the kind of contrastivist picture that Spinoza gives, although most of the time these reasons cannot be known to us, right? And so here he basically says for each thing, there is a sufficient reason, right, for why this, that, or the third happened. But he says that for most of the time, we can't know them. Why? Because he reserves that knowledge to God. And despite this fact, though, he says our reasonings are based on these two great principles. Of course, the more you dive into Leibniz, this idea of infinite analysis of a contingent proposition comes up, because for him, that's precisely the reason that for a contingent truth, or contingent proposition, its facticity can't be known to us. So Bennett says in response, it's kind of hopeless to interpret this infinite analysis. But my response to that is actually, well, hold on, that guarantees, Bennett, what you argue against Spinoza. That this is precisely how he frees space Leibniz for compatibilism, right? So I think it's ironic that he says this, whereas I think he actually needs it to ground his kind of view. So moving on, though, there's another work a little earlier called On Contingency, where Leibniz actually talks about the relation between necessary and contingent propositions and their relation to the PSR. So this goes back to something I said in passing. For in necessary propositions, when the analysis is continued indefinitely, it arrives at an equation that is an identity. But so that for Leibniz, necessary propositions, as I mentioned, they bottom out in an identity between subject and predicate, right? That you can fully account for them, and that's okay. But in contingent propositions, one continues the analysis to infinity through reasons for reasons, so that one never has a complete demonstration, though there is underneath a reason for the truth, but the reason is understood completely only by God, who alone traverses the infinite series in one stroke of mind. Right, so we get in Leibniz this kind of idea again, right, reinforcing what he'll say later in the monadology, that it's only God who completely computes contingent propositions. Whereas for us, right, we're limited intellects. All right, the amount of hairs on my head can't be known to me, or this, that, and the other thing. But for God, that's nothing but easy child's play. So some key takeaways of kind of Leibniz's view here is that really he centers God. Right? His PSR centers the fact that for contingent propositions, they don't actually bottom out in anything we can necessarily know. Right? But it is necessary, I think, to mention for Leibniz that it still puts the PSR kind of in this first person plural. Right? It's like we can't understand the reasons for it, but we know there's a God who can. Right? So God takes this kind of primary role for him. So let's just call God the prime knower. And that's basically to say that God computes the unqualified depths of contingencies which don't reduce to this identity of subject and predicate, which we see in necessary truths. So for Leibniz, we may never know why brown cows don't make chocolate milk, but the focus is not on our finite intellects, right? The focus is on God, right? So I can give a couple of reasons for why brown cows don't produce chocolate milk, right? Like there's nowhere that the cocoa would come from, right? You need to add it later, like milk, this, that, or, the chemical structure is not the same. But notice, remember, for Leibniz and Spinoza, it's not just about the reasons given, but it's also the reasons not given, right? And so that long list of reasons not given is something that my finite intellect can't fully understand or compute. So things which don't exist, or properties in a thing which exists that aren't shared with that other thing, still demand a reason why they don't exist, right? And this is always understood by God. And I think it's important to note, here I've got it just as PP, but the principle of plenitude, right, is another way of kind of putting this point, right? There has to be some condition blocking the existence of a certain thing which exists. And this is the kind of conundrum that, if you remember Leibniz's correspondence with Clarke, especially early on, the question of whether there can be infinite amount of matter, right? Leibniz can't come up with a reason as to why the amount of matter that God instantiates could be more or less. So God just has to do all of it, which is infinite matter, right? But Clarke, of course, thinks that's ridiculous because that would lead to necessitarianism. So leading on here, I want to get through Leibniz. This will be the last couple slides on him before we move to Du Châtelet. In the new essays, Leibniz says that he maintains that the conception of creatures is not the measure of God's power, right? So it's not the case that because I can understand it, that has some bearing on God, but that their conceptivity or ability to conceive is the measure of nature's power. Everything in conformity with the natural order can be conceived or understood by some creature, right? So this is an interesting case for me because this is Leibniz kind of reeling back a bit. And so I'll keep it brief, but let's call this the creature conception conformity thesis, right? That if there's some regularity in nature, that me as a natural being can understand that, right? So I'm going to skip a bit here because I want to get to Du Châtelet's view. But interestingly, I think it's worth noting that for Leibniz, at least, it seems like we're in a position to where, given what he says in the new essays, what he says about the PSR can't also hold, right? It can't be the case that just because there's some regularity in nature that I can perceive it based on what he says in the new essays. But then you go back to what he says in the, before in monadology and contingency, and he basically says we can't know it. Right? So let's transition here to talking about Du Châtelet's PSR and how I think it gets past some of these issues that I've talked about in Leibniz. So I want to conceive of Du Châtelet's PSR as a middle ground kind of between Spinoza and Leibniz. So Spinoza gives this very unabridged PSR, which people like Bennett think bottoms out in necessitarianism. But for Leibniz, it's more bridge, right? He's a compatibilist. So he thinks that for us, right, we're epistemically limited, but God has full knowledge of these contingent propositions. So I think Emilie du Châtelet's PSR, again, is a way that we can both ground laws of nature and also is a law of nature. So I'm going to move now to talking about how I see it kind of threading the needle. So leading up to her view of the PSR, here's what she basically says about it in the Institution de Physique. She says the principle on which all contingent truths depend, and which is neither less fundamental nor less universal than that of contradiction, is the principle of sufficient reason. All men naturally follow it, for no one decides to do one thing rather than another without a sufficient reason that shows that this thing is preferable, to the other. Right, so we see in Du Châtelet this kind of propensity to make the PSR more than just about the realm of like metaphysics. Or for her, it also guides practical truths. It's one realm of nature for her. So the PSR has this kind of intuitive appeal, which is something that she kind of gets from Leibniz, but it also guides our practical reasoning. Right? It's more than just a causal principle, though, and I hope to show this in the next slide. It's also about what we can come to know or not know. So she writes this: we cannot force our mind to accept something without a sufficient reason. That is to say, without a reason that makes us understand why this thing is what it is, rather than something completely different. Right? So she kind of, in a sense, modalizes the PSR, right? It's for her, it's both an epistemic and metaphysical principle, but it still relates always back to us, right? We cannot force our mind to accept it without a sufficient reason, right? But I think the idea here is that she still says why this thing is what it is, right? There still is this kind of natural order, I think, that she wants the PSR to kind of track, right? So it's kind of, in a sense, it's the old idea that realism is already idealism, I think, is something at play here. So it's both in nature and in our heads. Why? Because these are both in nature. I mean, I think that's the short and sweet. So here's a bit more before I get to some of the stuff related more directly to natural law or laws of nature. She says, when asking someone to account for his actions, we persist with our own question until we obtain a reason that satisfies us. And in all cases, we feel that we cannot force our mind to accept something without a sufficient reason. So here it's still, again, to do with, right, us, our mind, us accepting it, us obtaining a reason that satisfies us. And my gloss is this is actually very similar to some other moments in Spinoza and Leibniz on the PSR. So I can't remember which letter, but there's a letter where Spinoza talks about this portrait of a prince, right? In which you can always ask, right, who painted the portrait, or of whom is the portrait a painting of, right? And so that very question goes to show that, right, you aren't satisfied until you actually obtain the answer. So the PSR is operative not just at the laws of nature, but also in our understandings of the things, right? And so Leibniz says something similar about geometry books. And again, I cannot unfortunately remember exactly where he says this, but the idea is that, right, it's all about our acceptance of a sufficient reason, but also this sufficient reason itself. So I think she kind of captures the focus of this point, but talking about the epistemic side of causal relations as she talks about the PSR. So then I think this is where we get into leaving the kind of epistemic realm a bit, what she says about the PSR, which translates into laws of nature. And she writes this, if we tried to deny this great principle, we would fall into strange contradictions. For as soon as one accepts that something may happen without sufficient reason, one cannot be sure of anything. For example, that a thing is the same as it was a moment before, since this thing could change at any moment into another of a different kind. These truths for us, or excuse me, thus truths for us would only exist for an instant, right? So the PSR is regularity, right? It tracks a kind of regularity, and it also tracks our ability to recognize this regularity. So she gives three examples of this famously, but I'll talk maybe just briefly about one of them, which is her basically the example of her room. And she says, you know, it's a classic thing, like David Hume. If I leave the room, do I know it exists still? For her, it's if I leave the room, do I know that what's in the room remains in the same place which I left it? Right. So if we deny the PSR, we're forced to admit that if things could happen for no sufficient reason, that I could come back into my room after study and the books could be strewn about and right, the glasses could be upside down, and etc. Right. So for her, the PSR is a background assumption of regularity beyond just the anatomy of contingent propositions. Right. So for her, I think it's not just about, again, that kind of laws of nature, so to speak, metaphysical level, but it's also this epistemic thing too. And I think her discussion of it is a little more holistic as far as, you know, comparing her to Leibniz, where he thinks of it a little more distant, I think. So in other words, it's a law. So this is another really famous line to in du Châtelet's Institution de Physique, which helps to see the kind of first person plural in the PSR. She writes, "A man must also know the reason why a thing exists. If he does not see this reason, as often happens when things are too complicated, quand les choses sont trop compliquées, he must at least be certain that one could not demonstrate that the thing in question cannot have sufficient reason for its existence. Thus, in all that exists, there must be something making it possible to understand why something that exists could exist." This is a really important clause. Donc, tout ce qui existe, quelque chose pas où l'on puisse comprendre. Right? It's in the you've got puisse there, so it's in the subjunctive. This is what is called sufficient reason. Right? So a lot of people, like, for example, scholar of Chatelet, Aaron Wells, thinks of this as her PSR being modalized, right? It's this kind of making it possible to understand why something that exists could exist. Not just the existence of the things themselves, but also the possibility of our understanding. So I think it's important to note here that for Leibniz, it's that we often don't understand them. For her, it's often that things are too complicated and we don't see it. But if we're to accept something, it still is based on our being able to understand a sufficient reason. So then she writes this after. "But once it has been established that a cause is good, only insofar as it satisfies the principle of sufficient reason, insofar as it contains something making it possible to show how and why an effect can happen, then it becomes impossible to substitute these grand words for ideas." Right? The PSR is about making things concrete. And I think for her, this entails a very different view from Leibniz. The causes of contingent truths must show internally why and how their effects follow. And further, this is not just for God to compute, as I've noticed, but it's also about our finite comprehension of these things, right? Our ability to perceive these regularities in nature. So I think moving on here to talk more directly to kind of move into a conclusion about what du Châtelet is saying about laws of nature and the relation to the PSR. When you take a look at chapter 6 of the Institution de Physique on movement, rest, and simple movement, it's interesting because she actually gives a kind of Newtonian account of the laws of motion, and she calls them laws of nature. And here she writes, "A body at rest will never begin to move by itself. Since all matter is endowed with passive force," of course, that idea of vis viva, which I can't talk about a ton here, unfortunately, but the kind of, contraposing or distinguishing Newton from Leibniz. In order for motion to happen with sufficient reason, there must be a cause that sets this body in motion. So in Emilie du Châtelet's discussion of what the laws of nature and laws of motion are, we have a discussion of sufficient reason. And so first I've got Newton's laws, which I won't go through all of them, but I'm going to compare these very briefly to her ideas about the laws of motion. Because what she does is she basically takes Newton's laws and then she injects the PSR into each of them. All right, so I won't go over them, but here's her gloss on the laws of nature, or laws of motion. So first we've got a body preserves in the state it is in, be it rest or motion, unless some cause, right, that's very key, brings an end to its motion or to its rest. Second, we have the change that happens in the motion of a body is always proportional to the motor force that acts on it. And no change can happen to the speed or direction of the moving body except by an exterior force. For without that, this change would happen without sufficient reason. The reaction is always equal to the action, for if a body could not act on another body if this other body did not resist it. Thus, the action and the reaction are always equal and opposite. So here we see again her injecting this idea of the sufficient reason in these in these laws of nature. And so I think her approach to the PSR is to claim a responsivity of our minds to the reasons extant in things themselves, making them knowable to us. So what she's basically doing is she's taking the kind of view that I talked about to begin in kind of Armstrong's philosophy of science, that the kind of vicious circle of laws of nature being uniformities in nature is actually a virtuous circle. Because this most fundamental law, that is the PSR, grounds observable regularities of the other laws. And so thank you for listening. I'm excited to hear your questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Andrew. That was really a clean sweep of all the rationalists and beyond. So we got definitely a lot of material there. I'm going to interrupt the recording now so that everybody can feel more comfortable asking their questions. But before I do that, I would like to thank again everyone who participated to this seminar series, VAMP 2024. Thank you again.